Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. We're doing another show here. We are talking about the Book of Judith as we continue our series through the scriptures with our lecturer and instructor here, Louis Dizon. So, Louis, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Um, this is funny. The very first comment that pops up, has this been a series?
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the previous videos on Genesis through Tobit have not been getting too much attention. But yes, this is a series, and we have just covered like a good chunk of the Old Testament. So we are now in the Book of Judith. Whew, can't believe that we've made this much progress. Um, and I enjoy it because I whenever in the it's some at least a month, sometimes more in between each episode, and that gives me time to like really do deep dives into the text, and you discover things that you do not pick up on just from like a surface
Yeah.
level reading of the text. So um, you'll for those who have seen some of the previous shows I did on this series, I do like deep dives into like textual criticism and like um, some of the historical issues surrounding the books. And there's plenty of that to talk about in Judith as well. And I look forward to doing that.
Yeah, and look forward to this one, especially since it's a deuterocanonical book. You don't hear enough about
That's
those,
right.
so yeah, let's go ahead and
That's,
dive in. I think you're sharing your screen, so let me add that.
yep,
There
there
it
we
is.
are.
Mhm.
Um, so the little bit of background for the Book of Judith. Um, the book itself is written. Our earliest extant texts of it are actually in Greek, but there's a common idea that it was probably originally in a Semitic language, either Hebrew or Aramaic. Unfortunately, we don't have any extant Hebrew or Aramaic versions of Judith anymore. And the reason why we think that it was probably in Hebrew Aramaic is because there are a lot of Hebraisms or Semiticisms in the text, um, which gives us a hint that there was probably uh, a Semitic original to the text. And in fact, St. Jerome, who composed the Latin version of Judith, said that he translated his out of an Aramaic text. So we know that Aramaic versions of Judith existed at some point, and St. Jerome had access to one of them. Um, and some of these, and if you look at the Latin, then you know that another Aramaic version stood behind it, which is different from the version that stands behind the Septuagint because at various points they're going to read differently. So that's the other thing that's worth noting with regards to reading the Book of Judith. Um, so your experience of the book is going to vary slightly. Um, with depending on whether you're reading a version that is based on the Latin Vulgate, such as the Douay Rheims, or one that's based on Septuagint, which is the majority of other translations. And one of the ways that I'm gonna show you that is that I'm gonna read the first couple of chapters of Judith, and then I'm gonna make note of some places where the Douay Rheims reads differently because it's based on the Vulgate rather than Septuagint. So let's read the first couple chapters of Judith, and you'll get an idea of how different the two are. Um, so in verse chapter 1, verse 1, it says here, in the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh, in the days of Arphaxad, who ruled over the Medes in Ecbatana. So here, in verse 1 of the Douay Rheims, it says, now Arphaxad, king of the Medes, had brought many nations under his dominions, and he built a very strong city, which he called Ecbatana. Notice, Nebuchadnezzar is not mentioned in the first verse of the Douay Rheims. He doesn't get mentioned until verse 5. This is where the two texts converge. So let's read the rest of this. Starting verse 2. He is the king who built walls around Ecbatana with hewn stones 3 cubits thick and 6 cubits long. He made the walls 70 cubits high and 50 cubits wide. At the gates he built towers 100 cubits high and 60 cubits wide at the foundations, and he made its gates, which were 70 cubits high and 40 cubits wide, so that his armies could march out in force and his infantry form their ranks. Um, it was in those days that King Nebuchadnezzar made war against King Arphaxad in the great plain that is on the borders of Reggae. So here you have a bit of a difference, because in verse 5 here, it's mostly the same, but there is that little part that says, and overcame him. So you'll see that Nebuchadnezzar does defeat Arphaxad in both texts, but where it happens is different. Here it happens right at the very beginning. Here it happens much later on. And in verse 6, he was joined by all the people of the hill country and all those who lived in the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Hydaspes and in the plain of King Arioch of the Elymians. Many nations joined the forces of the Chaldeans. And then in verse 6 here, you see that it's much shorter. It just says, in the plain, great plain, which is called Regua, about the Euphrates and the Tigris and the Jadison, in the plain of Arioch, the king of the Elysians. And then in verse 7, it says here, then King Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrians sent to all who lived in Persia and all who lived in the west, those who lived in Cilicia and Damascus and Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon, and all who lived along the sea coast. And then in verse 7, here it says, and then was the king of Nebuchadnezzar exalted, and his heart was elevated, and he sent to all that dwelt in Cilicia and Damascus and Libanus. So one of the differences that comes out if you're comparing the two texts is that here Nebuchadnezzar is calling on the nations to help him in his war against Arphaxad. Here, he had already defeated Arphaxad by the time he calls on the nations. So what is he calling them for? Presumably to celebrate his victory with them. And you'll see it here. The rest of the text says, and those among the nations of Carmel and Gilead and Upper Galilee and the great plain of Esdraelon and all who were in Samaria and surrounding towns and beyond the Jordan as far as Jerusalem and Bethany and Chelus and Kadesh and the river of Egypt and Tapanis and Ramses and the whole land of Goshen, even beyond Tanis and Memphis and all who lived in Egypt as far as the borders of Ethiopia. But to all who lived in the whole region, disregard the orders of the king Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrians, and refused to join him in the war, for they were not afraid of him, but looked upon him as only one man. And they sent back his messengers empty-handed and shamefaced. Here, you can see that this whole section in gray is not there. It just says, but they all with one mind refused and sent them back empty and rejected them without honor. And then, without reading the rest of this, it says here that Arphaxad was defeated. You don't get that here because Arphaxad was already defeated earlier. In chapter 2, you get a bunch more differences. In the Septuagint version, as you can see, is significantly longer. And the main difference appears in the fact that, first of all, you can see in verse 1, it says the 18th year here and in the Septuagint, and only the 13th year in the Douay-Rheims. And then in verses 5 through 13, this is the part where Nebuchadnezzar summons Holofernes, and it says here that he gives this long spiel about what he wants Holofernes to do. But if you read the Douay-Rheims, it's much shorter. He only says in verses 5 to 6, go out against all the kingdoms of the west and against them especially that despise my commandment. That I shall not spare any kingdom, and all the strong cities thou shalt bring under my yoke. So if you look at the screen, all the text that's in gray is not in the Douay-Rheims version. So why is the Douay-Rheims different from Septuagint? You might ask. Well, to answer that question, I'm going to refer to something that St. Jerome himself said. So I have here the Anchor Bible commentary on Judith, which is one of the best commentaries on the text, and there's actually a quote from St. Jerome where he talks about the fact that he got a hold of an Aramaic text of Judith, and then he translated it quickly in one day. Um, and from what we are told, St. Jerome did not spend too much time editing the text, so he did it rather hastily. You may also recall that St. Jerome questioned the canonicity of the Book of Judith, so he did not hold it in as high regards the proto-canonical books, but he did translate it regardless, because the Pope told him to. So the fact that he translated rather hastily, and he also mentioned that he translated rather loosely, might account for several of the differences between two texts. So the Vulgate version, as reflected in Douay-Rheims, actually is a looser translation that was not prepared necessarily as carefully as a more literal text would be produced. Um, so that will actually, there's one more variant that I want to bring up, and that is in Judith chapter 10, verse 4. Um, and this is way over when Judith is preparing to deceive Holofernes. In chapter 10, verse 4, it says, "And she put sandals on her feet, and put on her anklets, and bracelets, and rings, and her earrings, and all her ornaments, and made herself very beautiful, to entice the eyes of all men who might see her." By contrast, in the Vulgate, it says, "And the Lord also gave her more beauty, because all this dressing up did not proceed from sensuality, but from virtue. And therefore the Lord increased this her beauty, so that she appeared to all men's eyes incomparably lovely." So another slight difference here: Judith made herself very beautiful, whereas in the Vulgate it says the Lord made her appear more beautiful. So there is a supernatural element that you might get from reading the Douay-Rheims or the Vulgate that you wouldn't get from reading of a Septuagint-based translation. Um, so that is the textual issue that you might notice if you are reading. If you might notice if you're comparing different versions of Judith. A few other things to note about reading the book. So canonicity of the book. The is well-known fact that Judith is not in Protestant Bibles. It's also not in the Hebrew Bible. This does not mean that the Jews completely ignored Judith. In fact, there are actually various midrashim on the story of Judith. And again, the Judith commentary on the Ankle Bible commentary makes note of this. The rabbinic Jews were aware of the Judith story, and they had variants of it that were retold in the various midrash literature, which is interesting because usually you only made midrash of books that you considered canonical. So why were the rabbinic Jews making midrash of Judith if it wasn't part of their Bible? You know, it gives you this idea that their notion of canon would have still been a little bit flexible at around the time that these midrashim were being composed. They did not necessarily think of these books as completely non-biblical. Now, if you get to the Christian witness, the Book of Judith was quoted as scripture fairly early on. If you think of the Book of First Clement, for example, you'll see that Clement regards Judith as scripture. So this is in the, let me just pull it up, in chapter 55, verses 4 and 5 of the Apostolic, First Clement. It's found in the Apostolic Fathers. Here you will see that the that Saint Clement mentions a number of important figures as examples for the Christians to follow, and one of those people is Judith. In chapter 55, verse 4 and 5, he says, "The blessed Judith, when her city was besieged, asked the elders to suffer her to go out into the camp of the strangers. So she gave herself up to danger and went forth for love of her country and her people and and their siege, and the Lord delivered over Holofernes by the hand of a woman. So you see here um, that Saint Clement regarded Judith as canonical. He quotes from it as scripture and uses it as an example for the Christians of what a faithful woman who believes in God would be like. And then when you get to later church fathers, um, there's a general consensus that Judith is canonical. There's only like a few exceptions to that rule. I believe Saint Athanasius, for example, in his 39th Festal letter, did not regard Judith as canonical. Saint Jerome did not regard as canonical, but they were the minority opinion. Majority of the other church fathers did regard Judith as canonical. Um, and then the other issue, moving on, that often comes up when reading Judith, besides the canonicity, is the historicity of the book. So there's this general idea, for example, first, forgot to mention that the book was composed probably during the Maccabean period or a little bit after. And the reason we know this is that the purification of the temple is actually mentioned in the Book of Judith. So this would appear in, let me pull it up. It is in chapter, forgot which chapter it was in. Just give me a second. So in Judith chapter 4. So a little bit of context. You'll see here in chapter 4, verse 1 to 3. By this time, the people of Israel living in Judea heard of everything that Holofernes, the general, the king of Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrians, had done to the nations, and how had plundered and destroyed all their temples. They were therefore very greatly terrified at his approach, and were alarmed both for Jerusalem and for the temple of the Lord their God. For they had only recently returned from the captivity, and all the people of Judea were newly gathered together, and their sacred vessels and the altar and the temple had been consecrated after profanation. Well, what is the profanation that is being discussed here? Those who are familiar with the history of Israel will recognize this as the profanation that took place under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, as recounted in the Book of Maccabees. So we haven't covered First Maccabees yet, but we'll read a little bit of it because it's important to make note of for knowing the background of Judith. So you can see here, it talks about the temple being reconsecrated after its profanation. And this occurs in First Maccabees 4, where Judas Maccabeus is lamenting the profanation of the temple, and then after he liberates it, the priests come and they reconsecrate it. So this happens in the latter half of the chapter, between verses 36 to 61 of First Maccabees. The fact that this story is alluded to in Judith will give you a hint as to when the book was composed. It could not have been earlier than the 2nd century, otherwise it would not be referring to the profanation, reconsecration of the temple, which is interesting because the main character of the main bad guy in the story is Nebuchadnezzar, right? When did Nebuchadnezzar live? It was 500 years earlier, as you might recall, 400 to 500. This was during the first temple period, before the exile happened. But how could that be the case? You have Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, he's said to be the ruler of the Assyrians. We know that he was the king of the Babylonians, not the Assyrians, and his capital city was not Nineveh. So there you already see what the anachronisms are in the book. And then you also have the problem that there is Arphaxad mentioned as the king of the Medes, but we have no record of a king Arphaxad ever ruling over the Medes. Furthermore, the general that Nebuchadnezzar sends out, Holofernes, is actually Persian, is a Persian name. The same goes for Bagoas, the other character that is mentioned later on in the book, who serves as an advisor um, to the Assyrian army. So you got an Assyrian army led by a Babylonian king with a Persian general and a Persian advisor, referring to events that happened during the Hellenistic period. So it's a massive stew of anachronisms taking place. And a vast majority of people reading the text have noted that there is no way that this could have been an accident. The author is deliberately mixing up time periods, you could say. And there are generally two opinions as to what is going on with the Book of Judith here. So the one theory that we have is that it's referring to certain historical events, but the reference were changed up. Um, and there is a hint of truth to this because some of the events uh, that are mentioned in Judith do roughly correspond to real events that we know of. For example, the military campaigns attributed to King Nebuchadnezzar here are actually similar to the military campaigns of an Achaemenid Persian king named Artaxerxes III. Artaxerxes III actually did have a general named Holofernes, an advisor named Bagoas, and he did actually go to war against a number of other nations to consolidate his rule. So when you're reading the Book of Judith, it is actually alluding to this figure from Persian history. And of course, the aforementioned events pertaining to the temple is well known in history as well. That happened during the Maccabean period, which means that the Book of Judith is not referring to one discrete event. It's referring to a number of events from both the Persian period and the Hellenistic period. Um, so it is referring to history, but it's loose history. Um, and the reference are not always clear. Now, uh, the other school of thought with regards to how to interpret Judith is that it is historical fiction. It's not meant to present history in any meaningful sense. It's only written to tell a story as well as to provide an example, a moral example for the reader to follow. And the fact that you have a mixing of different time periods is one of the arguments used to present this. And the other one is the fact that even though some of the parts of the book seem to be referring to historical events, there are also a number of things here that do not seem to correspond to anything we know from history. Um, we are not aware, for example, that there was ever such a city as Bethulia. So the main place that is mentioned in the Book of Judith is the city of Bethulia. This is where the main character comes from. So Judith is a native of that town, as well as several of the other minor characters in the book. However, you know, it's hard to tell what is Bethulia in this context. Some have suggested that Bethulia is actually a reference to Jerusalem. These are usually the people who believe that these are referring to events in the Maccabean period. In fact, one commentator, Charles Ball, actually suggested that Judith is like a gender flipped allegory for Judas Maccabeus, which is a very interesting theory, to say the least. Um, but the but the connection is so loose that a lot of people suggest that this second half of the story is just pure historical fiction. And in Catholic circles, there is no definitive opinion that has been dogmatized by the church. The church actually leaves it open how to view the Book of Judith. One could view it as historical fiction, or one can view it as disguised history with the reference changed up. The vast majority of Catholic commentators prior to relatively recent times took the disguised history approach. So they believed that all the events here referred in some way or another to a real event that happened, even if we didn't necessarily know what those events were. Um, and since we don't know what events they would have referred to, if they are referring to any events, it's best to leave it as a question mark. And, the church has wisely left it at that. Moving on from the historical issues of the book, it's worth noting that there are certain theological and moral issues that come up in the book as well. So one has to do with what is the purpose of the book? Why was Judith composed to begin with? So different commentators have different theories on what the purpose of Judith was in the point of view of the original author. So the most probable explanation is that Judith was composed to present an example of what the ideal Israelite should be. So Judith, you'll notice, sounds like a feminine version of Judah. So Yehudit, it's literally Jewess if you want to look at it. So the female Jew is the main character of the story, and she is an example of what the ideal Jewish person should be like. So if you read the second half of the book, Judith is, in modern popular culture, she is what we would call a Mary Sue, a character that seems to have no flaws. Everything about her is perfect. She is presented as beautiful, God-fearing, pious, um, very generous to everyone around her. So she is a combination of all these virtues. Um, and and many commentators believe that this is so that people can look at Judith and see in her an example of what the ideal God-fearer should be. And in fact, if you saw how Saint Clement, Pope Saint Clement quotes from the Book of Judith, he takes the text as referring to that. So from his perspective, Judith is a character that we're supposed to emulate. The providence of God is another important theme in the book. So if you'll notice, one of the differences between Judith and, say, Tobit that we read previously is that Judith is largely free of any obvious supernatural interventions. So the only real supernatural event that happens in Judith would be, if you look at the Vulgate version, it talks about how the Lord made Judith appear more beautiful. And even then, the Septuagint version doesn't have that. So God is at work through Judith, but he's not at work in some explicit miraculous sense. His work is more subtle and more providential. So many of the characters pray for his aid, and you can sense the Lord working in the background by, for example, making Holofernes and the Assyrians predisposed to accept Judith. Um, the Bible frequently talks about how God is the one who turns men's hearts as he wills. You see this in Proverbs among other places. Which leads us to the next major issue that comes up with Judith, which is that if she's such a virtuous character and we're supposed to emulate her, why does she tell a lie? You'll notice this from chapter 10 onwards, where she explicitly talks about how she plans on deceiving Holofernes. Actually, it's not chapter 10. I believe it's in chapter 9. It says here in verse 10, By deceit of my lips, strike down the slave with the prince, and the prince with his servant. Crush their arrogance by the hand of a woman. So Judith is planning to use deception to liberate her people. And this is repeated in Judith chapter 16. If you look at 16 verses 5 to 10, talks about her deceitfulness. But the Lord Almighty has foiled them by the hand of a woman, for their mighty one did not fall by the hands of the young men, nor did the sons of the Titans strike him, nor did tall giants set upon him. But Judith, daughter of Merari, undid him with the beauty of her face. She took off her widow's mourning to exalt the oppressed in Israel. She anointed her face with ointment and fastened her hair with a tiara and put on a linen gown to deceive him. Her sandal ravished his eyes, her beauty captivated his mind, and the sword severed his neck. The Persians trembled at her boldness. The Medes were daunted at her daring. So you have here a song praising Judith, but one of the things that she is praised for is her subterfuge here. So, which leads us to the question, is lying ever justified? Of course, we know this is not the only place where a biblical character lies for the greater good. The Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1 do the same thing, as does Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. So there's a long tradition of characters in the Bible using deceit, and you'll notice for some reason it's always the female characters who do it too. And another less obvious example, but is closely related to what we just read, is actually the story of Jael or Yael in the Book of Judges. I won't read the whole text, but it's in Judges 4, verses 17 through 24, where Sisera, the Canaanite leader, goes into the tent of Heber, the Kenite, and meets his wife Jael, and she gives him hospitality at her tent. And while Sisera is lulled into a false sense of security, Jael kills him with the hammer and the tent peg. This is the story that is most similar to the story of Judith, because they both involve killing someone by striking them in the head while they're sleeping in a false sense of security in a tent. So there is a clear allusion to Jael in the Judith story here. So, why does the Bible present these characters as using lies or deceit or subterfuge to do the greater good? According to a number of commentators, what the lesson here is not that lying is okay under certain circumstances. In fact, Saint Thomas Aquinas actually talks about the specific story that we just read. So let me pull up here the quote from Aquinas, and this is cited in the Old Testament introduction by Brant Petrie and John Bergsma. So in Aquinas' Summa, it states here, "Some, however, are commended in the Scriptures not on account of perfect virtue, but for a certain virtuous disposition, seeing it was owing to some praiseworthy sentiment that they were moved to do certain undue things. It is thus that Judith is praised, not for lying to haul off her knees, but for her desire to save the people, to which end she exposed herself to danger, and yet what might also say that her words contain truth in some mystical sense." So according to St. Thomas Aquinas, Judith is a virtuous woman, not because she lied, but because she intended to save her people. And she also did not tell total lies. In fact, one of the things that you might notice if you look at some of the quote things Judith says is that she does something that might be called double talk, where you could understand them in the sense that they are true in a way, but they wouldn't be true the way Holofernes would have interpreted the words. Um, for example, uh, there's some not interesting ones here where it said where Judith says that here. As your soul lives, my lord, your servant will not use up the things I have with me before the Lord carries out by my hand what he is determined to do. So what does by my hand mean? In the back of Judith's head, she's probably thinking, deliverance for her people by slaughtering Holofernes. But Holofernes would not have understood it that way. He would have understood it to mean when Judith receives a message from God to invade the Israelites. So this is what St. Thomas Aquinas probably had in mind when he said that her words contain truth in some mystical sense. So that is the important thing to take away from Judith. It is not teaching us that lying is necessarily justified, but that um, the intentions of the characters are what God takes into account and praises them for. A couple of other things to note. We just saw that the story of Judith, quote, is referring back to the story of Jael in Judges. That's not the only cross reference that we can make note of. So there are a few other things. One is the fact that certain phrases um, in Judith are actually repeated in the New Testament. So in Judith 11, verse 19, it says, "Then I will lead you through the middle of Judea till you come to Jerusalem, and I will set your couch in the midst of it, and you will lead them like sheep that have no shepherd," which is similar to something that Jesus says in the Gospels. Let me pull it up. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 34. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without the shepherd, and he began teaching them many things. So that phrase, sheep without a shepherd, the idea is alluded to in the proto-canonical books, but it's really only the Book of Judith that uses that exact phraseology. So the fact that that exact phraseology is used in Mark is an indication that Mark is at least aware of Judith and is using similar terminology as Judith. Also, Judith does refer back to the book of Exodus. So one of the things that not a lot of people may be aware of is the fact that the Song of Moses in Exodus 15 has a lot of parallels with the Song of Judith. So it says here it begins, if you look at the whole of the 16th chapter, it is similar to the 15th chapter of Exodus. In the first two verses, it says here, "Begin a song to my God with tambourines, sing to my God with cymbals, raise to him a new psalm, exalt him and call upon his name. For God is the Lord who crushes wars, for into his camp in the midst of the people he delivered me out of the hands of my pursuers." If you look at Exodus 15, verse 1 to 3, it says, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I'll praise him, my father's God, and I'll exalt him. The Lord is a man of war, the Lord is his name." And then in verses 3 to 4 of Judith, it says, "The Assyrian came down from the mountains of the north. He came with myriads of his army. Their multitude blocked up the valleys. Their cavalry covered up the hills. He said he would burn up my territory and kill my young men with the sword, and put my infants on the ground, and hand over my children as prey, and might take my virgins as booty." Um, this is similar to Exodus 15, verses 9, where it says, "The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide my spoil, my desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them." And then it says, in verses 5 through 16 that the Lord foils his plan, and the people will sing in praise of what the Lord has done, which is similar to what happens in Exodus 15, verses 10 onwards, where it says here that God caused the sea to drown the Egyptians, and then it says that the people are to praise God as majestic in holiness, among other things. And then it ends with, and in Judith, it ends with uh, a warning to the nations not to come against the people. Woe to the nations that rise up against my people. The Lord Almighty will take vengeance on them in the day of judgment. Fire and worms he will give to their flesh, and he shall weep in pain forever. So this is a warning um, against all the people, which is similar to Exodus 15 onwards, where it says, now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed, trembling seizes the leaders of Moab, all the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as a stone, till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you purchased. So in both cases, the nations are warned not to mess with Israel. There's also a reference here to Isaiah 22, verse 24, which talks about the fire that consumes forever. So let me pull up that verse from Isaiah. And they shall go out and look on the bodies of the men who shall have rebelled against me, for their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. So the idea of eternal torment is already present in the book of Judith, contra certain people who might suggest that this is something that occurred later in history and wasn't necessarily present in the Second Temple period. You can see that the idea is already fully developed at this point, and it's based on a similar verse that occurs in Isaiah. So there's um, a lot of cross-referencing going on. One final thing to note is the allegory, so the typology of the book. So Judith is actually seen as we mentioned, the ideal Israelite, and in Christian interpretation, it actually becomes she becomes sort of like a typology for the church. So she is how the church should ideally be like, and of course, the most perfect example of a believer who follows that ideal is the Virgin Mary. So Judith becomes a type of the Blessed Virgin um, for many Christian commentators of this chapter. So just as she is beautiful and wise and becomes a means of foiling the plans of the enemy, so the Blessed Virgin also functions in um, salvation history as um, the fairest of all the women of Israel, whom God chooses to defeat the plans of the serpent by means of her son. And because of that, the Book of Judith is often read during significant Marian feasts. I'm trying to remember which specific feast of the Virgin is Judith in the lectionary. Um, it's in one of them. I don't remember off the top of my head which one it is. But that is a connection that Christians have historically made. So, with that, hopefully, that will give you some insights into the book of Judith. Um, and up next, we have the book of Esther, which is interesting because Judith and Esther are actually often taken together as two different examples of what a virtuous woman should be like. And although Esther is in the Hebrew Bible, the Catholic version is longer because it's taken from Septuagint. We'll talk about that next episode, God willing.
Thank you for that, Lewis. There are, let's see, I'm seeing some comments here.
Yep.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, good deal. And you said we're going over Esther next time.
Yes, that will be the next Bible commentary episode.
Looking forward to that one too.
Yeah,
It's also an interesting one when it comes to its canonicity.
yeah.
Comes up often a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
good deal.
we're
Well,
gonna
thank you
take
so much.
now.
I'm sorry.
I see a couple of questions. Are we gonna
Yeah.
take those?
Go ahead and grab them. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so Absurd Scandal asks, is the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is called the king of Assyria contextual clue to reveal Judith is at least partially fiction? Um, that is how some people take it. Um, so one view is that there's no real um, historical reference to any of this. But it's not necessarily the case. Some believe that Nebuchadnezzar is a code for someone else, and the two main candidates for who Nebuchadnezzar could be is either the Persian king Artaxerxes III or the Greek king Antiochus IV. And if you look at how Nebuchadnezzar is portrayed in the Book of Judith, he has elements of both. So you can argue that Nebuchadnezzar in Judith is a composite of these two characters, with maybe shades of the historical Nebuchadnezzar thrown in for good measure. Um, Now, is Judith venerated as a saint universally? If so, does it mean Judith is indeed a historical figure? I don't know too much about that. I'm not aware that, at least I've never heard of like maybe like Judith being celebrated in like the calendar of the saints per se. There is, I mean, it's possible that there was a historical figure named Judith. I could go either way on that one. Um, as to what exactly she accomplished, that one is another question. So it's hard to really say what parts of Judith could be historical and which parts are historical fiction. So that would be difficult to um, determine just from reading the book. Hmm. And as for the question of could the Babylonians have been called the Assyrians, I suppose it's possible. The issue, though, is that even if we took that to be the case, a lot of what is attributed to the Assyrians and Judith were not things that would have made sense um, given the storyline. For example, the Israelites are said to have returned from exile, which would have placed it after the Babylonian period. And the temple is reconsecrated, which happened during the Hellenistic period. So even if Assyrian here meant Babylonian, that doesn't really, solve all of the historical issues. I think that it makes most sense to think of the Assyrians here as a composite of multiple peoples, the Persians and the Greeks, you could say, but definitely not the historical Assyrians. Hmm.
Thank you for that, Lewis. And I appreciate y'all watching. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and be on the lookout for a date for the next time when we address the book of Esther. But once again, thank y'all for watching, and we will see y'all later. God bless.